Have you ever wondered what happens when history erases a crime so terrifying that even the executioners pretended it never happened? Imagine a single woman, her name whispered only in frightened tones, standing in the glow of a roaring coal furnace. 14 men, the very men who owned the land, who owned lives, dragged to their final screams, the smell of burning flesh mingling with smoke that blackened the night sky. The year was 1716, the place, a forgotten corner of the Spanish colonies, where silence was more valuable than truth. But ask yourself, why would an entire empire bury the name Esperanza de Lima? Why were the witnesses silenced? And what secret did those flames try to consume, along with the men inside them? Tonight, we dig into the forbidden story that history never wanted you to hear. The year 1716 does not immediately conjure horror in the minds of most who study history, for the records of that time are layered in polite phrases and the dry ink of colonial bookkeeping. Yet beneath the surface of those ledgers and maps was a world far darker, one where silence itself was currency and cruelty was the hidden foundation on which empires built their wealth. Across the vast territories claimed by Spain and Portugal, the plantations stretched outward like scars carved into the land, each field a monument not to prosperity, but to domination. Sugar, cotton, and coffee grew in long, endless rows, but they were watered by sweat, by blood, and by the cries that vanished into the humid night air. The owners of these estates lived as kings in miniature, their power unchecked by any authority, save their own greed. They controlled not only the land, but the bodies that worked it, human beings reduced to property, their voices swallowed by laws written in languages not their own. To step onto a plantation in that era was to enter a realm governed by fear. The overseers walked the rows with whips coiled at their sides, and each crack of leather was both a command and a warning. The sun itself became an enemy, burning down upon bent backs while the air shimmered with heat that never relented. The enslaved and the indentured alike labored until their muscles gave way, for there was no escape from the cycle. To falter was to invite punishment. To resist was to vanish. The silence that hung over those fields was not natural. It was enforced, pressed down by the weight of terror. Yet within that silence there were things the owners could never fully suppress. Glances exchanged at night around meager fires, whispers in forbidden tongues, the fragments of songs remembered from distant homelands. These were sparks, almost invisible, but they carried a dangerous potential. The authorities knew it, though they never admitted it openly. That was why punishments were made public, why executions were staged with ceremony, not to deliver justice, but to remind every eye watching that rebellion would be met with spectacle. Fear was theater, and the plantations were its stage. But history has a way of muting these realities. The documents left behind by colonial officials speak of harvests, trade routes, and profit margins. They describe the weather, the output of fields, the efficiency of furnaces and mills. What they do not describe is the cost in human suffering. For that, one must look between the lines, into the shadows cast by what is missing. How many names were never recorded? How many lives erased the moment they ended, leaving no trace except the memories of those who dared not speak? This was the hidden colonial world of 1716, not the one celebrated in royal courts or painted in maps, but the one lived in the dirt and the dust, where silence was survival. Plantation owners were not merely businessmen. They were rulers in miniature kingdoms, men who believed themselves untouchable. Their homes were built like fortresses, white-walled structures that gleamed in the sun while inside the air was heavy with imported perfumes and the smell of roasting meat. They dined in excess, drinking wine shipped across oceans, while just beyond their walls, the people who sustained their luxury gnawed on scraps and slept in huts of wood and thatch. To these men, cruelty was not seen as cruelty. It was considered discipline, order, the natural state of things. They told themselves stories that justified their dominion, twisting scripture and law until both bent under the weight of their ambition. In such a world, the humanity of those beneath them became invisible. A broken body was accounted for as a financial loss, not a human tragedy. When epidemics swept through the fields, the dead were counted not in grief but in numbers, as though they were livestock lost to disease. And always, silence was maintained. The victims did not cry out to authorities, because the authorities themselves were the masters or their allies. There was nowhere to turn, no court that would listen, no priest who would risk his standing by, condemning the very men who funded the church's construction. Silence was enforced not only by the whip, but by the structure of society itself. Yet, within this darkness, the pressure built. For every lash, every injustice swallowed, a memory was created, passed quietly from person to person. Stories of cruelty became legends of warning. Names of the cruelest overseers were remembered, etched not into documents but into whispered tales told to children. And slowly, a thought began to circulate in the unspoken spaces. What if silence broke? What if the very furnace that powered the plantations could be turned against those who believed themselves beyond consequence? By 1716, the system was beginning to show fractures. The constant importation of enslaved peoples from Africa and the movement of indigenous laborers across colonial lands created volatile mixtures of culture and resentment. Rumors of rebellions in other territories spread like smoke, carried by sailors, by merchants, even by priests who had seen too much and said too little. Though the plantation owners convinced themselves they were safe, there was unease in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement that no empire built on fear could last forever. It is here, in this atmosphere of suffocating cruelty and restless silence, that the name Esperanza de Lima first appears. She was not a queen, not a noble, not even someone of wealth or influence in the traditional sense. She was a shadow, moving through this hidden world, a woman who had witnessed more suffering than most and who refused to let silence consume her. The very structure of colonial life had taught her that voices were dangerous, that stories could spark revolt. And so, she did not speak, she acted. The story of Esperanza cannot be understood without first grasping this hidden colonial world. To modern eyes, the act she committed seems unthinkable, burning 14 plantation owners alive in a furnace. But to those who lived under the weight of chains, perhaps it was not madness at all, but a mirror, reflecting back the cruelty, inflicted for decades without pause. In 1716, silence was everywhere. Yet silence, when stretched too far, can snap, and when it does not whisper. It roars. The records of the early 18th century were never meant to preserve the lives of the voiceless. They were designed to account for land, for coin, for men who held power, not for the women who endured in silence at the margins of empire. This is why the figure of Esperanza de Lima appears only in fragments, half seen in archives, hinted at in testimonies that abruptly break off, and whispered in oral stories that survived in secret. She is less a name than a shadow, but shadows often tell us more about truth than the official light. Some believe she was born to a Spanish soldier and an indigenous woman in the outer settlements of Peru, a child never fully accepted by either side. To the colonists, she was marked by her mother's bloodline, a reminder of the land they sought to dominate. To the indigenous, she carried the face of their oppressors. This in-between existence condemned her to a life where belonging was always conditional, where safety could be revoked with a glance. Others claim she was entirely of African descent, brought across the ocean in chains as a girl, and placed into servitude in the households of plantation elites. There, she would have been trained not in the fields, but in domestic labor, serving meals, cleaning chambers, tending to the families who held her future in their hands. Regardless of her true origin, what binds the stories together is her early exposure to cruelty. As a child, She saw men whipped until they collapsed, and women taken as though their bodies were mere property. She saw the silent mourning of mothers who buried their infants in shallow graves, without prayer, without record, without even a name to mark them. She saw the wealth of the masters rise from this misery, the glint of gold rings on their fingers, the sound of their laughter at banquets, the arrogance in their eyes, as if the world itself bent to their will. Esperanza grew within this environment of contradictions. She was close enough to power to see its inner workings, yet never truly part of it. She polished the silver cups from which the masters drank, but her own meals came from scraps. She cleaned the bloodstains from garments after an overseer's punishment, but she was expected to keep her eyes lowered, her lips sealed. This dual exposure granted her something others did not possess: knowledge. She understood the weaknesses of those who believed themselves untouchable. She knew their habits, their vices, their secret fears whispered after too much wine. Those who study rebellion often say it begins not with rage, but with memory. Esperanza carried memories like coals hidden beneath ash. Each injustice she witnessed was tucked away, smoldering quietly. She remembered the boy who lost a hand to a machete accident and was cast aside to die because he was no longer useful. She remembered the woman who screamed into the night as her daughter was taken to the master's bed, her voice silenced by blows. She remembered the night when lightning set a field aflame and workers were forced to battle the blaze with bare hands, the masters watching from safety as men and women collapsed in smoke. What pushed her from memory into action remains shrouded in speculation. Some accounts suggest a personal wound, that her younger brother, a field worker, was beaten to death by an overseer for failing to meet a quota. Others whispered that she herself bore a child fathered by a master, only to have the infant taken from her arms and discarded as unworthy of inheritance. Whether these tales are myth or fact, they capture the essence of her transformation, from a woman forced into silence to one who decided silence was no longer bearable. Those who later repeated her name often spoke of her demeanor, describing her as calm, deliberate, a woman who carried an unsettling stillness. Unlike others, who raged openly against their lot, she rarely spoke of her anger. Instead, she listened, she watched, and she planned. Servants noticed that she paid close attention to the workings of the coal furnace that powered the estate, how the fire was fed, how it roared when stoked, how it could consume wood, bone, or flesh without distinction. They said, she lingered near the furnace longer than most, not out of fascination, but as though she were learning, calculating. It is possible that her rebellion was not sudden but slow, built brick by brick, in the silence of her mind. Over years, she pieced together knowledge of schedules, vulnerabilities, escape routes. She understood when the masters would be drunk, when the guards would be inattentive, when fear could be turned against the fearless. Such precision suggests not madness, but intent. She was not a woman who snapped. She was a woman who decided. The society of the time gave women like her no avenue for justice. If she had accused her masters, she would have been dismissed, beaten, or worse. If she had sought protection from the authorities, she would have been laughed out of the room, for the officials themselves dined with the men she might have named. The church might have listened to her confession, but forgiveness would have been granted, not to her, but to her oppressors. In a world where every institution upheld the same cruelty, the only path left to her was one that bypassed them all. As rebellion, then, must be seen as both personal and symbolic. On one level, it was revenge, the settling of debts written not in ink but in suffering. On another, it was a message, a strike against a system that thrived on the illusion of invincibility. By choosing fire, she chose a weapon that was both literal and metaphorical. The furnace was the heart of the plantation, the machine that consumed to produce wealth. To turn that same furnace into the instrument of vengeance was to expose the truth, that the fire which had fueled their prosperity, could just as easily devour them. Some whisper she did not act alone, that she had allies among the servants, men and women who followed her not out of loyalty but out of desperation, knowing that their own futures were as grim as hers if nothing changed. Perhaps they helped her drug the wine, perhaps they dragged the bodies toward the furnace's mouth, perhaps they guarded the doors while she stoked the flames. If this is true, then Esperanza was more than a lone avenger. She was a leader, a spark that ignited the unspoken rage of the oppressed. What makes her story both fascinating and terrifying is the uncertainty that surrounds it. Colonial records, when they mention the incident at all, reduce it to a catastrophic accident, never naming her directly. Oral stories, on the other hand, elevate her into something more than human, a figure of vengeance, almost mythical, a woman whose eyes reflected fire and whose silence spoke louder than screams. Between these two extremes lies the truth, a flesh and blood woman, pushed to rebellion not by sudden madness but by years of brutality, exclusion, and loss. She is remembered not because she sought glory, but because she refused erasure. In a time when silence was survival, Esperanza de Lima chose instead to speak in the only language her world could not ignore, fire. The night itself began like so many others in the plantations of the Spanish colonies, cloaked in heat even after the sun had long fallen beyond the horizon. Heavy clouds pressed low, carrying the scent of rain that never came. In the great house, at the center of the estate, lanterns glowed against the dark, their light spilling across polished floors and high ceilings. The plantation owners had gathered, 14 men of wealth and arrogance, celebrating yet another successful harvest. The dining hall was thick with the scent of roasted meats, spiced wines, and the sweet smoke of imported tobacco. Their laughter rang out into the night, oblivious to the unease that seemed to settle outside their walls. Among the servants who moved silently through the hall was Esperanza de Lima. To them, she was invisible, just another shadow carrying trays and filling cups, a woman they never thought twice about. She heard their laughter, the crude jokes, the boasts of profit measured in human bodies. She kept her eyes lowered, but within her chest the fire was already kindled. Tonight would be the night the silence broke. It is said that the first of them stumbled after drinking too deeply from his goblet. His companions laughed at his clumsiness, mocking his drunkenness, never suspecting that his wine carried more than alcohol. Soon another faltered, his head lolling forward as though in sudden sleep. One by one, the revelers found themselves growing sluggish, their words slurring, their movements heavy. Some historians argue that Esperanza had slipped a drug into their cups, perhaps an herbal concoction known among servants, but dismissed by their masters as harmless superstition. Others suggest that she relied on their own excess, knowing that their greed for drink would weaken them more effectively than any poison. What is clear is that as the night wore on, the laughter in the hall quieted. Chairs scraped, goblets clattered to the floor. The great men of the plantations, who ruled by terror in the daylight, now lay helpless in the grasp of exhaustion. Esperanza moved among them with deliberate calm, her stillness masking the storm. Within, to some she gave a guiding hand, whispering that she would lead them to fresh air, to a place where they might recover. To others, she offered nothing more than silence, her eyes unreadable as she urged them from their seats. The path to the furnace was long and shadowed, winding through corridors that smelled of smoke and iron. The coal furnace itself was massive, its mouth a gaping black cavity that fed the estate's machinery. On most nights it devoured wood and coal, but tonight it would be given flesh. The fire was already burning, stoked higher than usual, its roar echoing against stone walls. The heat was suffocating, waves of it pressing outward, as though the furnace itself anticipated what was to come. One by one, the men were led to their doom. Some resisted, stumbling and muttering in confusion, but their strength was gone, their limbs heavy and uncooperative. Servants who may have joined Esperanza in her mission took hold of their arms, dragging them closer to the furnace's maw. Witnesses would later claim that the screams began then, weak at first, then sharper as the men realized the truth. The sound of bodies striking the stone rim, the frantic scrabble of hands clawing against the edges, the final panicked wails swallowed by the roar of fire. These became the night's music. Not all went silently. A few men, slower to succumb to drink, fought desperately. One tore at Esperanza's dress, ripping fabric as he struggled, only to be struck down by another servant wielding an iron poker. Another managed to cry out, his voice echoing down the halls, but it was too late. No one outside dared come to investigate. The world of the plantations was built on silence, and even the sound of dying masters was met with fear rather than action. The smell was unbearable. The air thickened with smoke, not only from coal, but from burning flesh. Grease hissed and crackled, mingling with the roar of the furnace, creating a stench that clung to the skin of everyone present. The servants who aided Esperanza covered their mouths and turned their faces, but she herself did not look away. Her eyes remained fixed on the fire, as though she were ensuring that no trace of them would remain. Hours passed in that infernal chamber. By the time the last of the 14 had been consumed, the furnace glowed with a furious brightness, its heat so intense the walls themselves seemed to tremble. Ash drifted into the air, settling on skin, hair, clothing, as if to mark everyone present as participants in the crime. No bones remained large enough to identify, only fragments that would be shoveled away in the morning, like any other waste of fuel. The men who had once ruled the land with arrogance and cruelty were now nothing more than smoke, rising into the night sky. What followed is pieced together from contradictory accounts. Some say Esperanza stood before the furnace and spoke aloud, her words lost to time, a declaration that the silence was over. Others insist she remained mute, her revenge expressed not in language, but in the sight of flames, consuming those who believed themselves untouchable. There are even whispers that she sang, a low and haunting melody, remembered from her mother's tongue, a song of mourning and fire. Whatever the truth, the act was unforgettable. By dawn, the estate was chaos. Servants whispered frantically, some terrified of discovery, others trembling with exhilaration. The absence of the masters could not be concealed, yet no one dared speak the truth. When the overseers searched for them, they found only the furnace still glowing with unnatural intensity. Its iron doors scorched black, its chamber reeking of something that was not merely coal. Some of the men gagged and turned away. Others demanded answers that no one dared give. Esperanza herself vanished in the confusion. Whether she escaped into the wilderness, was hidden by sympathetic allies, or perished in the attempt, is unknown. Her name appears in no trial records, no execution lists. She dissolved into myth as quickly as the men dissolved into ash. Yet, the memory lingered, carried in whispers among the enslaved and the free alike. A story too dangerous to speak aloud, yet too powerful to ever fully die. The gruesome night when 14 plantation owners vanished into the roaring mouth of a coal furnace became both legend and warning. To the authorities, it was an unrecorded shame, proof that their power was not absolute. To the oppressed, it was a flicker of possibility, evidence that even the mightiest could fall. And to those who heard the story centuries later, it was something else entirely, a reminder that history hides not only its crimes, but also those who dared to answer them with fire. The story of Esperanza de Lima could never have survived without whispers, because official records worked tirelessly to erase her. What we know of that night, of the furnace, of the screams, of the woman who stood before fire like a judge, comes not from polished reports, but from fragments of testimony, whispered confessions, and stories carried in secret across generations. The witnesses who saw too much were caught between two impossible choices: to speak and risk being silenced forever, or to remain quiet and let the truth rot in their throats. Most chose silence. A few, however, let words escape, just enough for her legend to survive. The first account comes from a night watchman, a man who had been stationed near the edge of the estate to patrol against thieves. He later admitted, under hushed breath in a tavern, that he heard strange sounds in the hours after midnight screams, muffled at first and then sharp, carried by the wind from the direction of the furnace. At first he thought it was punishment, some poor worker caught in an overseer's rage. But then the cries multiplied. 14 voices, rising in staggered chorus, cut off suddenly one by one. He spoke of a terrible heat that seemed to seep into the very ground, though he dared not approach. When asked why he hadn't sounded an alarm, he lowered his voice and said only this: "The fire told me not to." He drank heavily after that, and when pressed further, he refused to say another word, claiming that if he did, the fire would find him too. Another witness was a kitchen servant, a young woman who had been cleaning platters while the men drank themselves into stupors. She said she saw Esperanza pour something into their goblets, her hand steady, her face expressionless. When asked if she told anyone, the servant shook her head. She confessed that a strange calm had washed over her, as though Esperanza's silence had been contagious. Later that night, she followed at a distance as the groggy men were led down the hall. She did not go all the way to the furnace, but she saw enough: the flicker of firelight, the shadows of struggling figures, the unmistakable sound of skin searing in the flames. Her voice trembled as she remembered the smell, thick and cloying, clinging to her hair and clothes for days afterward. She never spoke Esperanza's name above a whisper, but she admitted she could not forget the sight of her eyes, fixed on the fire with neither joy nor sorrow, only resolve. From the overseers came only denial. They swore they had heard nothing, seen nothing, known nothing, yet in private, some muttered to each other of the furnace's unnatural glow. One man, drunk and fearful, weeks later, claimed he saw Esperanza standing in the courtyard that night after the deed was done, her face illuminated by the light of the blaze. He said she looked at him, and though she spoke no words, he understood her meaning. That silence was his only chance at survival. He never spoke her name again. Not all whispers came from direct witnesses. Some came second-hand, through those who pieced together fragments of gossip. A priest who traveled through the region wrote in his diary of confessions that unsettled him deeply. He mentioned no names, but described a woman who claimed to have seen her masters thrown into fire, and who begged God for forgiveness for remaining silent. The priest wrote that he granted her absolution, but added that he himself felt haunted by the idea that divine justice might look very different from earthly law. In the months that followed, survivors of that night lived in a peculiar state of fear. Without their masters, the estate should have descended into chaos, but instead, a strange order held. The servants worked quietly, avoiding questions, their eyes lowered whenever officials demanded answers. When investigators pressed too hard, they met only silence. Some claimed the silence was fear of punishment. Others believed it was something deeper, as though Esperanza's act had broken not only bodies, but the very language of the estate. Those who had seen the fire seemed unable to describe it without trembling. A rumor spread among the workers that to speak Esperanza's name aloud was to invite the furnace back into the world. They avoided saying it, substituting words like the woman, the shadow, or she who burned. Even children were warned not to ask questions. Silence became a shield, one that protected them from the wrath of colonial authorities, but also from the memory of that night. Yet silence, paradoxically, also gave rise to whispers, stories told under blankets, behind closed doors, to trusted ears. Whispers are not bound by law. Whispers are stronger than chains. In one version of the tale, Esperanza did not vanish into the wilderness, but remained hidden among the workers, disguised in plain sight. This story claimed she walked past officials every day, invisible in her servitude, while they scoured the land for a fugitive who was already beneath their gaze. Another version told of her escape into the mountains, where she joined runaways and rebels, becoming a leader in secret gatherings. These variations cannot all be true, yet each was sustained by witnesses, who swore to have seen her in one form or another. The fearful silence of the survivors was the most telling evidence of all. When questioned by magistrates, they answered only with shrugs or confused stares. Some claimed not to remember anything from that night, as though memory itself had abandoned them. Others fell ill, trembling violently when asked to describe the furnace, their words dissolving into incoherence. It was as if Esperanza's revenge had left a mark not only on the flesh of the dead, but on the minds of the living. Trauma silenced them more effectively than any whip. Over time, the authorities grew frustrated. Without clear testimony, without bodies, and with only rumors of fire, they had little to write into their reports. The official line became that the plantation owners had died in an accident, perhaps trapped in a fire sparked by coal. But even as ink dried on those reports, witnesses kept their secrets alive in whispers. They did not believe in accidents. They believed in Esperanza. The most chilling accounts came decades later, when the survivors were old and near death. In their final days, some spoke of visions that haunted them still. One man confessed that he woke every night to the sound of crackling fire, his room filling with smoke no one else could see. Another claimed that he heard screams whenever he closed his eyes, the voices of the 14 men calling out for mercy. That never came. None of them ever dared to curse Esperanza. They spoke of her not with hatred, but with a kind of grim respect, as though they had witnessed something larger than human vengeance. Something elemental, and so the story endured. Not in records, not in proclamations, but in whispers. Whispers from trembling witnesses who carried the weight of fire in their memories. Whispers from survivors too afraid to speak, yet too haunted to forget. Whispers that turned Esperanza de Lima into something more than a woman. She became a shadow, etched into their silence, a name they could not say aloud, but one they could never erase. In the aftermath of her parents' murder, Esperanza de Lima's life became a study in silence. The fields that once rang with her laughter as a child now pulsed only with the monotonous grind of forced labor and the whispers of the overseers. She carried their absence like a brand upon her skin, every day waking to the same question that dug deeper into her bones. Why had her family been reduced to ash while the men responsible feasted on sugar and rum as if nothing had ever happened? The memory of their screams, though faint, was enough to fuel a bitterness that never dimmed, a flame that smoldered quietly in her heart. Esperanza was not a woman born for submission. Though she had learned the art of waiting, she became adept at watching the masters as they strutted through the fields, listening to their careless boasts, their drunken laughter, their cruel punishments inflicted without hesitation. She memorized their habits, who lingered at the tavern too long, who staggered home at dawn, who kept the keys to the storehouses. Patience became her weapon, for she knew a single act of rebellion, reckless and unplanned, would only lead to her death, and her death alone would change nothing. She wanted their blood to echo, to leave a mark no plantation could erase. The others on the plantation knew she was different. Many of the enslaved had been broken into silence, their eyes dulled by endless seasons of toil. But Esperanza's gaze remained sharp, alive with something untamed. She was neither reckless nor loud, but her quiet endurance unsettled even the overseers. A woman who suffers without outward complaint can be more dangerous than one who openly resists, for she learns the inner workings of her captors, and Esperanza had learned much. At night, when the others collapsed in exhaustion, she would whisper her plans to the darkness. She studied the furnace, the great coal-bellied monster that powered the plantation's refinery. It burned day and night, consuming endless cartloads of wood and coal, turning raw cane into sugar crystals that lined the pockets of the very men she hated. To others it was a machine of industry. To Esperanza, it was a mouth waiting to devour. She began to dream of the day when the balance of power would tilt, when the same heat that fed their wealth would consume their flesh. But before fire came strategy. Esperanza had to build alliances carefully, for one wrong word could betray her to the masters, and the punishment for conspiracy was unspeakable. She sought out those whose grief matched her own. A man whose brother had been whipped to death for stealing a scrap of bread, a woman whose infant was sold away, a youth beaten blind for daring to speak his mother tongue. Each bore their own scars, and though fear choked their voices, Esperanza found ways to plant seeds of vengeance. She never demanded their loyalty. She offered a vision instead, an image of freedom won through fire. Some recoiled, too terrified to imagine such a thing, but others, drawn to the intensity in her eyes, began to listen. Slowly, Esperanza gathered fragments of trust. They worked together in secrecy, testing the edges of the plan. She scouted the plantation grounds with an attention to detail that bordered on obsession. She learned where the guards changed shifts, how the locks were fitted, where liquor dulled the masters into carelessness. Every day she carried herself as if she were just another weary laborer, while inside her mind sharpened, like a blade. The turning point came one humid night, when Esperanza overheard two plantation owners mocking her mother's screams. They laughed about how cheaply her life had been extinguished, no more significant than a spark snuffed in the wind. That night she wept, not from grief, but from the searing certainty that waiting any longer was no longer possible. Rage crystallized into resolve. She would act, and when she did, their names would vanish in smoke. Still, she was not blinded by emotion. She understood that vengeance without purpose was only a fleeting satisfaction. If she was to risk everything, it must be a reckoning that reverberated beyond herself, a message to the oppressed and the oppressors alike. She began to craft the plan in meticulous detail. The furnace would not only burn them alive, it would be a spectacle, a reversal of roles. The men who treated human beings as fuel for their empire would themselves be thrown into the fire. She rehearsed every possibility in her mind, how to lure them into the refinery, how to trap them, how to silence the overseers before they could sound alarms. She imagined the smell of coal mixing with flesh, the glow of flames reflected in terrified eyes. Yet she also considered failure, the chains, the whipping post, the noose. Still, her decision never wavered. Better to die in the blaze of retribution than live in the shadows of their cruelty. Those closest to her began to notice the intensity radiating from her. Some urged caution, warning her that vengeance would only invite endless reprisals, that others would suffer if she acted. Esperanza listened, but did not bend. Her suffering had already stretched across years, her pain already echoed in the blood of innocence. She carried not only her parents' ghosts, but the ghosts of countless others who had no voice. If she perished, she would at least die having spoken in the only language the masters understood: violence. Her preparation became ritual. Each day she touched the furnace walls when no one was looking, feeling the heat pulse against her palm as if the machine itself was conspiring with her. She whispered her parents' names to its roaring belly, promising them justice. She sharpened her focus, cutting away all hesitation, until she became a vessel of singular purpose. Her fellow conspirators began to call her La Sombra del Fuego, the shadow of fire, because she moved with calm certainty, yet carried the promise of destruction. By the time her plan neared completion, Esperanza was no longer the broken daughter of the murdered. She had transformed into something else, an executioner shaped by grief, an architect of terror born from silence. Those who looked into her eyes in those final days described them as hollow yet blazing, like a coal that has burned so long it no longer needs flame to radiate heat. She was ready. The furnace that had enslaved her people's labor would soon be fed a different fuel. And though none yet knew it, The master's laughter had already died, smothered in the certainty of a reckoning they could never imagine. Esperanza's silence was nearly over, and when she spoke, it would be through fire. The night after the furnace fire, the town did not sleep. Doors were bolted shut, shutters nailed down, and not even the usual drunks wandered the cobbled alleys. The only thing moving through the streets was the rumor, thick, unrelenting, carried on every hushed voice. Esperanza de Lima had done what no one dared to imagine. She had turned the masters into fuel, their flesh and bones consumed by the same furnace that had once swallowed the coal ripped from the earth by their slaves. 14 men, gone in one blaze, their screams rising higher than the church bell ever could. But the question was not only how she had done it, but why the silence that followed seemed almost rehearsed. Records would soon blur, names disappear, and the official accounts would reduce the event to little more than a whispered ghost story. Yet for those who were there, the air still smelled of ash, and the shadows on the walls moved in ways that reminded them of burning men clawing for escape. There were survivors not of the fire, but of the moment. A child peeking through a cracked stable door swore he saw the outlines of figures dancing inside the flickering furnace light. An old woman, kneeling outside her home, heard what she later described as a chorus of sinners dragged into judgment. But these testimonies never entered any written archive. They lived only in oral whispers, buried beneath centuries of deliberate erasure. The colonial authorities had no interest in recording the truth of Esperanza de Lima, because her story was not one of punishment alone. It was one of resistance, defiance, and the terrifying possibility that those considered powerless could seize power in the most unforgiving way imaginable. The plantation economy of 1716 depended not just on land and sugar, but on the absolute subjugation of the people who worked it. The men Esperanza burned were not random figures, they were plantation lords, each tied to a network of wealth, brutality, and political connections stretching from Lima to Madrid. Their deaths were not simply personal revenge, but a blow against the system itself. But such an act could not be allowed to stand in memory. And so, even as their charred remains were quietly buried, the official line was crafted. There had been an accident. A coal furnace explosion, a miscalculation of air and fire. The bodies had been lost to the chaos. Nothing more, nothing less, yet silence is never perfect. Whispers leaked into letters. Travelers carried the story across oceans, and strange inconsistencies appeared in church records. 14 baptisms, 14 marriages, 14 confirmations, all men of status, and then, suddenly, 14 missing deaths recorded in haste, with no cause written down. Scholars centuries later would stumble upon this peculiar cluster, scratching their heads at the absence of details. A priest in Lima's cathedral crypt once admitted in private correspondence that the pages documenting those men's end had been deliberately removed. Removed by whom? He never said. The deeper mystery lay not just in the event itself, but in Esperanza's fate. Did she flee into the mountains, carried by allies who saw in her a symbol of divine retribution? Or was she captured in the days after, silenced before the fire's smoke had even cleared? The absence of her name in the punishment registers is telling. Normally, the Spanish colonial courts meticulously documented executions of rebels, heretics, and criminals, especially when women were involved. Yet Esperanza vanishes after the furnace. She is not recorded as executed, imprisoned, or even transported. She becomes a ghost present only in rumor, absent in every page of law. Some have speculated that her silence was bought or forced, that colonial authorities, fearing the spread of rebellion, ensured her disappearance would be as total as possible. But others believe something different, that Esperanza had already passed into legend, her existence too dangerous to erase, but too threatening to acknowledge. Within certain indigenous communities, Her name began to appear not in fear, but in reverence. Esperanza de Lima, they said, was not just a woman, but a flame sent to consume oppressors. Stories twisted her into something larger than life, a saint of vengeance, a guardian spirit who burned away cruelty. Children were told that the furnace still glowed beneath the earth, ready to ignite again if tyranny ever returned. And this is perhaps why the silence was so heavy, why witnesses refused to speak even under pressure. To speak her name in public risked punishment, but to keep it alive in private gave power to those who needed it most. Fear was not only of colonial reprisals, but of Esperanza herself. For if she could burn 14 men alive, what else might her spirit still do from beyond the records? The colonial world relied on order, on control, and her fire represented chaos and eruption that exposed the fragility of the system. In hushed taverns, sailors told the tale with embellishments. Some claimed the men were trapped inside the furnace, one by one, each screaming confession as the flames rose. Others whispered that Esperanza had not acted alone, that she had a circle of women with her, each pushing one man into the blaze, chanting curses as the air filled with burning flesh. Whether fact or exaggeration, the effect was the same: fear and fascination. A story too dangerous to publish, but too haunting to vanish. The true erasure came not only from colonial authorities, but from the men who benefited from forgetting. Families of the burned plantation owners quietly distanced themselves from the memory, erasing names from genealogies, destroying correspondence, and painting over portraits. To acknowledge that their fathers and uncles had been consumed by the hand of a woman was to accept shame, weakness, and a legacy of terror. Better to bury them twice, once in the earth, and once in silence. But history resists burial. In archives across the Atlantic, fragments still surface. A half-burned letter, describing a woman's fire of judgment. A journal entry from a sailor mentioning a strange furnace blaze in Lima. Oral stories that still carry Esperanza's name, centuries later, spoken in low tones like an invocation. What is erased has a way of clawing back through cracks, demanding attention, refusing to stay quiet. And perhaps that is Esperanza's real legacy, not the fire itself, but the silence that followed, the way history bent and broke to contain her, and the uneasy truth that it never fully succeeded. The secret behind Esperanza de Lima's vengeance was not only in the fire she unleashed, but in the world that had shaped her into someone capable of such horror. To understand why 14 men were locked inside a furnace and left to burn, one must first trace the unyielding road of her life. In the early years of the 18th century, South America was a land swollen with contradiction. It was fertile, yet starved, overflowing with wealth, yet ruled by cruelty, adorned with faith, yet infected by corruption. Esperanza was born into this paradox, the child of a mother who died under a planter's whip, and a father erased into the anonymity of slavery. She grew up knowing that life itself was precarious, fragile, like glass, always a breath away from being shattered by someone with power. Every lash, every scar, every face lost to fever or punishment etched itself into her memory, until pain became the language she spoke most fluently. By the time she reached womanhood, Esperanza had seen things no soul should carry. She witnessed men broken on the wheel for daring to steal food, women dragged into plantation houses at night, returning with eyes hollowed by what could not be said, children sold off like livestock, their cries echoing in the humid air long after the wagons had rolled away. To her, these were not isolated cruelties. They were rituals, carefully maintained, to ensure silence and obedience. And yet, Esperanza was not silent. She listened, she remembered, and she waited. Unlike so many, she learned how the system worked, who controlled the sugar shipments, how the overseers rotated their guards, which furnaces were stoked through the night to fuel the engines of wealth. She saw not just suffering, but also the machinery that sustained it. And somewhere in her grief, a seed of rage took root. The fire she would one day ignite, began long before the night of 1716. It began with small acts of defiance. She whispered to the others in the fields, warning them when punishments were near. She learned how to slip bits of food from storage without being caught. She smuggled herbs from the edges of the jungle, teaching others how to use them to soothe wounds or slow fevers. To the planters, she was invisible, another nameless laborer. To those around her, she became something closer to a shadowed saint. This was how Esperanza forged her power, not with swords or muskets, but with memory, with trust, with the willingness to risk everything for those who had already lost it all. But in every story of rebellion, there is a moment where patience can no longer survive. For Esperanza, that moment came with the death of her younger sister, a girl barely 12 years old, who had caught the eye of a visiting owner. She was taken into the great house one night and returned lifeless by morning. The explanation was thin, the burial hurried. The girl's face was bruised, her breath extinguished by hands that would never be punished. It was then that Esperanza understood what she had always known in fragments. There would be no justice here. Not from courts, not from priests, not from the crown across the sea. If justice were to exist, it would be carved from fire and blood, and she would be its instrument. The plantation owners believed themselves untouchable. They held their feasts in candlelit halls while outside. The very people who had served their meals were whipped for moving too slowly. They laughed, never imagining that one among their slaves might hold in her heart the blueprint of their destruction. Yet Esperanza studied their arrogance. She watched the furnaces where coal and sugar were processed, blazing hot enough to consume steel. She knew their entrances, their guards, the moments when fatigue blurred vigilance. The furnace was the center of their wealth, the glowing heart that allowed sugar to be transformed into gold. She saw not just a machine, but a tomb waiting to be sealed. On the night of reckoning, Esperanza did not act alone. Whisper by whisper, she had gathered others who shared her resolve. They moved silently, not with weapons drawn, but with hands steady, hearts clenched against fear. They knew the risk. For every act of rebellion discovered, dozens were executed. Yet what is a life worth, if it is lived on a leash? As the owners feasted, intoxicated with their illusions of power, Esperanza's plan unfolded. One by one, their path into the furnace house was sealed. The night air was thick with coal dust, the orange glow of the fire spilling out like the breath of a sleeping giant. The owners stumbled in, lured by a ruse of sabotage and threatened wealth, and then the doors closed. No scream in history has ever fully carried across centuries, yet the echoes of that night seemed to reverberate still. The planters realized too late what trap had been laid for them. The heat clawed at their throats, smoke swallowing their lungs, skin blistering in seconds. To the enslaved who watched from the shadows, it was both horror and vindication, a reversal of the order they had been forced to endure. For a single night, the roles were broken. The masters became prisoners, the powerful reduced to ash. Esperanza stood outside, her face lit by firelight, watching not with triumph, but with the gravity of one who knows there is no turning back. It is said that some among the enslaved wept as the flames devoured their tormentors, not out of pity, but out of fear of what might come next. For every fire, there is retribution. Esperanza understood this better than anyone. She did not imagine that her act would pass unnoticed or unpunished. She did not seek survival. What she sought was transformation, the kind that could not be erased by whips or chains. By burning those men alive, she inscribed a message into history itself, that cruelty breeds its own inferno, and that no empire, no matter how gilded, can forever suppress the fury of those it crushes. The aftermath of that night rippled like a wound across the colonies. Rumors spread faster than ships could sail. Who was this woman? Was she a witch, a demon sent to punish the godless? Or was She's simply human proof that even the most oppressed could shatter the illusion of control. Esperanza's name became a whisper of both fear and inspiration. For the planters who survived in neighboring estates, she was a warning. For the enslaved, she was a symbol that their lives were not entirely powerless, that even in chains, fire could still be born. What remains most haunting about Esperanza de Lima is not just the act itself, but the silence that followed. Records were buried, names erased, details twisted to paint her as madness incarnate rather than resistance embodied. History prefers its rebels forgotten, its fires extinguished. Yet the story survived in fragments, passed by word of mouth, etched in the collective memory of those who refused to forget. It lingers because it forces a question too dangerous for rulers and historians alike. What happens when the powerless discover that vengeance, once kindled, burns brighter than fear? You've just stepped into a part of history most were never meant to hear. Stories like Esperanza de Lima's are not simply buried, they're erased, hidden behind walls of silence, because they force us to confront the darkest truths about power, cruelty, and rebellion. If this story unsettled you, if it left you questioning how much of history has been rewritten or deliberately forgotten, then you're exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. Every week, we uncover the secrets that were locked away, stories of forbidden history, hidden crimes, and lives that dared to resist the system, no matter the cost. These aren't just tales to be heard. They're warnings. They're echoes of voices that refuse to stay silent. If you felt that chill, if you want to keep exploring the forbidden corners of the past, then hit that subscribe button right now. Don't just watch history become part of the community that refuses to let it die in the shadows. And I want to hear from you. What do you think really drove Esperanza de Lima to take such a horrifying, calculated act of revenge? Was it justice? Or was it madness? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and your perspective might just shape the next story we tell. So subscribe, comment, and stay with us, because the past is not as silent as they told you it was.